Many research reports and a great deal of scholarly writing refers to social structures of one sort or another. However, outside of specialist methodological and philosophic texts, what structures are and are not, and the explanatory role they perform in argument is rarely clarified. Difficulties inherent in defining social structures are well known. However, simply noting that a problem exists is insufficient. It matters if or when social structures are invoked in argument without explanatory clarity. And when we think about, for example, explanations pertaining to clinical activity, to nursing activity, how relative weights attached to individual agency and structural influence is self-evidently important. How we interpret these abstract concepts matters to the understandings we construct. Associate Professor Lauren Ross of the University of California Irvine offers fresh insights into the problematic of structure in her paper, What is Social Structural Explanation? A Causal Account. In this paper, and links to Lauren's work and the paper being discussed are provided in the notes, in this paper it's argued that social structures gain explanatory power or traction when they act as causal constraints. Please, Lauren, hello, thank you for joining me. Would you provide an outline of the argument presented in your paper, and where social structures and individual agency are both referenced in explanation, how do these factors interact?
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to do that and also to be here today. Thank you. This is a paper, as you said, that is engaging with social structures, and it provides an argument for when these factors cause and explain various health outcomes. Common examples of social structures include things like insurance policies, access to education, finances, and different factors that are lumped into socioeconomic status. And there's an interest in whether these structures, social structures, cause and explain different types of health outcomes. These often include stress that individuals or patients have, and in other cases, whether they eat a healthy diet or an unhealthy diet. So as an example, and one that's discussed in this paper, there's an interest in explaining why some groups of individuals in society eat a healthy diet versus an unhealthy diet. And there's two main causal factors that are debated. One of them is that whether a patient eats one of these diets or the other depends on the choices that they make. Just did they decide to choose and to eat a diet of fruits and vegetables and other food products that are viewed as capturing the healthy diet, or did they make a different choice? And the alternative, and another factor that's sometimes cited in these explanations, is that often what also matters is the social structure and other types of resources that the patient has access to. So part of what I suggest in this paper is that in many cases, those social structural factors actually play the main explanatory role in causing, producing, and telling us why the patient eats, in this case, an unhealthy diet or a healthy diet. And a way to understand this, in a way that I provide an analysis of social structures, is that they're well understood as causal constraints. An analogy to think of here is if you have a riverbank and a river that's flowing, the riverbank is something that constrains the flow of the river. So if you are navigating a boat in the river and the river forks and it can take you in 3 different directions, then you have a choice to take one of these offshoots of the river or another, and you can choose which downstream location you go to. However, if you're navigating a boat in a river that only leads to one downstream location and doesn't fork, then you don't have a choice about where you go. Your navigation and the choices that you make don't matter. This analogy well captures some cases where social structures constrain the choices that an individual can make. So in some cases, we have individuals who have so few resources that they can't even make a choice to eat a healthy diet in the first place. They can't choose to spend more money on fruits and vegetables and other factors that make up that healthy diet. What we find is that in many communities, we have individuals of low socioeconomic status. They don't have access to resources like finances. They might have less time because they need to work multiple jobs. And we often refer to some of these areas as food deserts because grocery stores aren't located nearby. And if you wanted to get to one, you'd have to travel far away. So if you're limited in terms of finances, you don't have a car, the transportation resources are limited, it's a lot harder to get access to the fresh fruits and vegetables and other factors that you need in a healthy diet. So part of what I'm suggesting in this paper is that we understand attempts to explain what causes these health outcomes with a model that appreciates that social structures can operate as causal constraints. So if you have an individual who is constrained in certain ways, they don't have access to various resources, they actually can't even make a choice to, or a decision to choose this healthy outcome. And we find similar types of examples in attempting to explain stress levels of patients, and other types of outcomes where social structural factors matter. Insurance is another example of a social structural factor that matters. This is something that's been gaining more attention in medical contexts. It's sometimes referred to as structural competency, where we're suggesting that healthcare practitioners pay attention to social structural factors that matter for the health outcomes of patients. So instead of just automatically saying that your patient is non-compliant when they don't take their medication, you might look at their background and whether they have insurance in the first place, whether they have the finances that give them access to purchase that medication. And this paper is really clarifying an argument for how one can show that social structure is a genuine cause of these outcomes and why and when it plays a bigger role in determining the outcome, the health outcome of the patient. And the suggestion is that it operates as a constraint that limits choices. And if it's an extreme constraint, it limits their choices so much that it determines the outcome because the patient essentially can't choose any other option. They essentially don't have options. So part of what you can see is this analogy to other types of constraints in everyday life, like riverbanks constraining the flow of a river. But we see this kind of model show up in many different scientific fields outside of the social sciences. And that's part of what we're interested in philosophy, is finding the same kind of explanatory pattern in different domains.
That's really interesting. I would heartily recommend people to look at your paper. It's really interesting. Would you say something about, I mean, there's lots of questions I could ask you that jump out from reading the paper, but would you say something about the relationship between your account and other accounts of structure, agency, causal interaction?
Absolutely. There are a number of ways in which this work can be both very abstract and very concrete. Philosophers and philosophers of science operate in this kind of milieu all the time. If you were to ask, for example, a scientist or a healthcare practitioner what their definition of causation is, they would view that as a pretty, odd, quite abstract question. But if you ask them, what's the cause of this disease? They definitely have a well-reasoned answer. And if you pushed them and asked, like, why, they could give you, of course, great principled answers to that as well. As philosophers, we're attempting to capture that principled rationale. This model that I presented is suggesting that a view of causation that's a bit more flexible than other understandings of causation. You notice that I used the riverbank example. One of the reasons why social structure is so puzzling is because some people assume that causation should operate like other types of analogies, that it should look like billiard balls colliding, billiard ball causation, where you have, two entities physically interacting, or dominoes, domino causality. One domino hits another. What's interesting, of course, about the social structure case and many other examples of causation is they don't fit those everyday life conceptions of causation. Part of what I'm suggesting here is that that's just one way that causation works. It doesn't have to have physical interaction features. Not all legitimate causal relationships in the world are like billiard balls colliding or dominoes. And while earlier frameworks limit and restrict causation to those kinds of, they're sometimes called mechanical interactions, where you have forces that capture causality. Part of what's being suggested here is you don't want to limit causality to just having those features. There are many cases where causal relationships don't involve physical interactions. If you look at early studies of genes and how they produce traits in organisms, part of what you see is a dependency relationship, or basically causation involving control. And so in this work, the suggestion is causal factors are factors that you can intervene on and change. And when you do that, they give you control over an effect. So control is the characteristic feature of causality. It fits the domino case, the billiard ball case, but also these other cases of causation. There's variety in terms of whether you have physical interactions, and causal relationships can vary in all other sorts of interesting ways. And it's the job of a philosopher of science, and in many cases scientists, to appreciate the diversity of types of causal systems. And one way that we can do this is by giving an analogy, like the riverbank example or these other examples, to help show what the features are of this causal system. So this is different from other accounts of social structural explanation because they can limit causation to physical impact causality. And this suggests that causation should be understood in terms of control, which is different from a physical impact model of causation.
Okay. Again, that was really interesting. So ostensibly abstract discussions about theoretic issues can be and often are important. And in a great deal of nursing's literature, a great deal of nursing research and scholarship explores nursing work and the contexts or environments in which that work occurs. And inevitably, this research and this scholarship cannot but trespass into the topic area discussed in your paper. Lauren, thank you for talking to me. And again, that was really interesting. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you, Martin.